IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarthak and I welcome you to All Things Policy. In today's episode, we are going to talk about the electric vehicle sector in India. The EV sector has been in the news. There have been multiple government interventions in the sector in the last 4-5 years. The aim is to push the adoption of EVs. So to discuss all this, we have two special guests, Ashwin and Manish. Ashwin and Manish also happen to be students of the current postgraduate program in public policy cohort. As part of the PGP, they have done a detailed analysis of the EV sector. And today's conversation is largely based on their research, on their findings. Hi, Ashwin. Hi, Manish. Welcome to All Things Policy.
Thanks,
Hi,
Sarthak.
Sarthak.
Pleasure to be on the show.
Hello, Sarthak. Good evening. Great to be here.
Good evening. So before we start, right, I had one quick question. You people had an option of analyzing any sector, and you chose to study the EV sector. Is there any reason for this?
Yes, indeed. So we are all either prospective auto buyers or enthusiasts in our own ways. So at a personal level, we have always had a few pressing questions, even as general consumers. Like questions like, will I have enough charging stations for an EV? Or I hope my car won't overheat and burn down. So we started from those very basic questions and moved on to more existential ones like, is an EV really the answer to solving the mobility carbon emission problem? Or has the government taken the right approach by choosing a specific technology for green mobility? Or should it just have let the market forces play out? So it was then that we, a group of three, a media professional, an automobile enthusiast, and a sustainability professional, got together and started evaluating the larger EV sector. And it was a work in progress sight to behold. Just a few high level facts for your reference. The EV industry itself started having a policy focus from 2018-19. And it was then that it virtually started from scratch. So with that perspective, within 4 years, it grew to be like 0.6% of the auto market in 22. And then within 1 year, crossed the threshold of 1.3%. That is doubling just in the past 1 year. So that was something which interested us a lot. Then we sort of started looking at why is this happening? So we realized there has been like 28 billion plus dollars of investment in the EV manufacturing just from 2020. 1/3 of this, by the way, has gone just into Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra. Now, if you add to this more than a dozen schemes and subsidies, both by the state and central government, which is bringing down the manufacturing cost and also the consumer buying cost of EVs, it just makes it a very interesting market structure also, where the market itself is very highly competitive and multiple startups have also mushroomed in the space. And then we looked forward, we realized there is a 10x growth predicted in the next 8 years for EVs, which would take the number of EVs selling in the market from something like 11 lakhs to more than 1 crore. So these were all, I would say, enticing enough reasons for us to further deep dive into this sector.
So basically, what you're trying to say here is there was some personal interest. And again, there is also this public policy concern over there, right? So basically, a thin line separates private from public here. Now, so as per your initial analysis, right, what are some of the issues in this sector, right? If you have to look at it from the supply side, or if you have to look at it from the demand side, any specific issue that you came up, you saw that. Manish, would you like to take this?
Yeah, sure. So, of course, supply and demand are some things which sound very formal, and that's part of the vigorous economics course we are going through.
In fact,
but let me
all
say-
economics is about supply and demand. Yeah,
That's right.
go ahead.
That's very clear to me. But just for the benefit of our listeners, I would say first let me talk about the consumer's perspective. So the consumer is the person who's demanding the EV. So let me talk from the consumer's perspective. That is probably like somebody like me who's an automobile enthusiast. So first thing which we discovered or understood was that there are lesser options in terms of four-wheelers that are available to the consumers as compared to two or three-wheelers. So as we see on the road, normally two and three-wheelers are used for small commercial sector and probably not so much for personal mobility. Most consumers would expect more options in terms of four-wheelers, which may happen over a period of time. Then, as a consumer, as a driver, as a user of an EV, the probably the most important point is kitna deti hai. What is the range that this vehicle will go? So, EV running on a fully charged battery, the range that it gives you depends on a number of factors, like the capacity of the battery, the speed at which you're driving, the load which is being carried in the EV, weather conditions, etc., etc. And most of us motorists who are covering long distance will be uncomfortable thinking that the EV has to be charged, charged
Quite
frequently.
frequently.
Yes, and where are these points available? Now, these will not bother a driver who's sitting in a internal combustion engine vehicle because petrol pumps, gas stations are plenty in the country. So currently, our estimate is that the charging infrastructure is not confidence inspiring as yet. It is not widespread. It is not readily available. Plus, it takes a significant amount of time for the battery to be charged. It's not like you fill your tank, have a cup of coffee, and you're ready to go. Well, no, the EV will take longer than a cup of coffee to be charged. The other thing is the life cycle cost. So, at the end of 5 or 6 years, which is typically the life of a battery, as we currently know, based on whatever vehicles we use at our home today, we don't know what will be the life cycle cost of EV vehicle. Last thing, as mentioned by Ashwin also, is the risk of fire. Now, the batteries are made of certain chemicals. A lot of research is going on in the world today to make them safe. But commonly, we see pictures, videos, incidents being reported of EVs catching fire in the high temperature environment. And this risk is more in a country like India. On the other hand, that is on the manufacturer's side, that is the supply side of the story, the first thing which would bother a person manufacturing an EV would be the initial material which is available, the initial material supply challenge. So, metals like cobalt, nickel, lithium, manganese, which are typically used in manufacturing the batteries of the EV, are available only in select locations globally, and most of the processing happens in China. And as we know, working conditions in these mines are absolutely abysmal, and the extraction purpose overall is very, very exploitive. It is akin to what we hear blood diamonds of Congo. So you have blood cobalt, which is going into the EVs. Then, as I mentioned, battery recycling is an issue even at the manufacturer stage. There are gaps at the policy level, uh, as also at the natural private market, which do not ensure battery recycling as of today. For the manufacturer, the cost of a new electric car would be around rupees 6 lakhs. And at this point, the consumer has an option to buy a new ICE car also. So, considering the uh, cons of an EV, he might just flip for an ICE car at that price point. Of course, electric's grid is a big issue. Whilst EV may be cheaper to run, but let us not forget that the electricity being used to charge the EV is still coming through a primarily fossil fuel driven electric grid. Then, of course, there is the whole value chain development, which is that either specialized supply chains or even industrial zones for EVs are currently non-existent, and as such, the R&D capabilities, ancillary auto parts developments, all are in the very infant stage, and which are important part of this ecosystem development. Sarthak.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is an interesting way to look at the problem, right? What are the issues which typically the consumers face, right? On the demand side, they don't have enough options, and then they have these apprehensions related to range anxiety. And also, what are the issues that suppliers typically face? For instance, the cost of production tends to be high because the battery itself tends to be high. The cost of the price of the battery tends to be high. Now, another way also we can look at these issues, in fact, there will be overlap, I'm assuming, between some of the points that you mentioned. Is there any failure in this sector? For instance, are there any government failures right now, or are there any market failures right now? So have you analyzed any of those market failures? Do you have information asymmetry or externalities in this sector right now?
Yes, absolutely, Sarthak. So, while Manish was also talking about cobalt, I actually remembered this very informative book called Cobalt Red by Siddharth Kara, and that was sort of our exposure to the larger supply chain challenges within EV. So that was probably one book which inspired us. The other book which really inspired us was this book by Guillaume Pitron. I'm very sure I'm getting his name pronunciation wrong, but he has this very book called The Rare Metals War, which is the dark side of clean energy and dark technology. Now, within that, he actually talks about how relocating the dirty industries has actually helped keep Western consumers in the dark about the true environmental cost of their lifestyles, of EVs basically. So now the double whammy is that this now, which is the true environmental cost of an EV, has been transferred from the Western countries to other developing or underdeveloped nations who mine and extract resources in even worse conditions for the environment and society. So we've noticed actually this combination of market and government failures at play because of this. And that's where sort of our hypothesis was that for the EV industry, in its current form at least, it has failed to deliver a socially optimal result. And we'll sort of run you through how. Let me sort of give you certain examples and run you through sort of how this network also works out. So, to begin with, the market failure of the type of externalities exist in the industry. So, EV industry has very clearly has a positive consumer externality, which is the GHG emission from the tailpipe emissions are non-existent. But we would like to deep dive a bit more on the negative production and consumer externalities and explain that a bit more to you. So, if you look at the negative production externality, it is for the stages of mining, refining, and the assembly of vehicles, which is currently not internalized into the economic cost of the vehicle. While the negative consumer externality is because it does not factor the electricity grid itself still being powered majority by fossil fuel and coal, especially for a country like India, where the fossil fuel or coal content in our main electricity grid itself is around 80%, compared to probably a Sweden or some other European country where they have transferred their grid itself to being like 60 or 70 or at least 40, 50% renewable. So that's a very big challenge for us in India. So while the current policies promoting EV are a response to the pollution from the internal combustion engine fossil fuel, which is actually emitting a lot more greenhouse gas emission, the unintended consequence of the same is that it has now shifted GHG emissions primarily upstream, which is what Guillaume Pitron was also talking about, which is that it has made it more invisible. It has now gone towards the source of minerals, factories, and where the cars are made, and to the this complicated international logistics that actually produces an EV. And essentially, if you look at the consumer side, right, keeping this in mind, people actually, in a way, at least what we have assessed, care less about reducing pollution. But that's one of the main reasons, at least, they're shifting to EVs. But the shift has also happened because in India, the total cost of ownership of EVs has been heavily subsidized and incentivized by the government for the consumers.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Ashwin, before we even move to the next part, right, where you are possibly talking about some government interventions, so I just want to summarize: the adoption of EVs is increasing, but EVs do not necessarily reduce emissions. That's what you're trying to say,
Correct.
or
The life cycle.
Yeah. So if you look at the entire life cycle of the EVs, from the production to their use, and again it will also require the batteries will also be not of much use after some point of time, how you are recycling the batteries. So if you take all these things into consideration, then the third parties here, maybe the environment, maybe the environment or some other maybe individuals as well, right, who are not necessarily the consumer of EVs, they are also negatively impacted because of the emissions. The externality, the sum total might not necessarily, the external cost might not necessarily be going down as compared to IC.
Absolutely.
So is there any study which tries to, or have you referred, or did you get any study which tries to find out the net externalities? You mentioned that there are some positive consumer externality, but there are negative production as well as consumer externality, right? So did you come across any source which tries to find the net of these things?
So that was the surprising thing, right? When we were reaching out and when we were trying to sort of do our research, primary, secondary, and looking at different research papers also which are out there, and what is really happening in terms of communicating an EV's benefit, we did not see a lot of talk about these negative externalities. So essentially, except for these academic and on the ground research books that I'm talking about, we did not see a lot of very quantified research happening on looking at putting a quantified cost into this environmental impact. So we identified that itself as a very big issue.
Yeah, exactly, right. And since we were just talking about how the government is coming up with different kind of incentives, so again, these incentives are based on the assumption that the overall external benefits are more than the external costs.
Absolutely. So, in a sense, what is happening is that a market failure of the IC emissions has led to a government intervention, which is now in itself a failure because it is subsidizing EVs that anyway still primarily get charged by fossil fuels in our electricity grid.
Yeah.
So, it's a very complicated web which has been formed.
Okay, interesting. Now, since we are talking about government interventions, I had interrupted you. We'll discuss this government interventions in a bit, but before that, we'll have a quick break.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Welcome from the break. Before the break, we were talking about the different kinds of issues, market failures in the sector. So there have been different kinds of interventions to address some of these issues. So Manish, what are some of the government interventions right now in the EV sector?
Okay, so this part is interesting because, as Ashwin pointed out, that because the government chooses to intervene into the sector, it has become a very kind of a process, a very challenging chessboard for the government. So I will try to point out some of the more important ones. First, of course, we should be aware of something known as FAME, which is FAME. It stands for Faster Adoption and Manufacture of Electric Vehicles, including hybrids, which is a government policy for progressing development in the EV field. Then they have tried to introduce production-linked incentives, where the Department of Heavy Industries has launched a certain PLI schemes for advanced chemistry and cell battery storage schemes. The government
is also
subsidies,
right?
They are subsidies. That's right.
Yeah.
The government is also pushing for certain e-mobility zones where probably only electric vehicles will be allowed to function. A big push is also for EV in freight transport because most of the heavy vehicles which are consuming fossil fuels are involved in transportation. So the government is keen for this sector to be impacted majorly by the EVs. There are other schemes like draft battery swapping norms, reduced duty on EV components, but these are all, I would think, these are the minor tweaks to the larger policy which has been promulgated under the FAME scheme. Apart from central government, the state governments have also been encouraged to incentivize this. So there are certain components of FAME which the state governments are progressing, like loans, scrapping and retrofitting of vehicles, permit and priority permits and toll waivers, generation of infrastructure for, say, charging, those associated infrastructure which is required, and also tax exemption and industry subsidies. So these are some of the more important schemes by which the government is intervening in this sector. Sarthak?
Yeah. This e-mobility zone that you're talking about, it is already there right now, or there is only a plan for setting up these e-mobility zones? Because I had no idea about it. So that's why I'm asking.
No, maybe Ashwin may correct me, but to my knowledge, there are no e-mobility zones as such, except probably the golf course where you have a golf cart running on a battery. But in the commercial sector, wide commercial sector, no. Wherever we see in the streets, two-wheelers and three-wheelers, which are being utilized in commercial sector, are running on the road along with IC engines and vice versa.
Okay.
So Sarthak,
So
this is actually successful models in Europe and China, in parts of Europe and China, which the Indian government also wants to emulate here. But as Manish rightly said, they don't already exist.
okay. So we know about some of the issues, the market failures here, and we also have an idea about the government interventions. Now, how good have been these interventions in addressing the issues, right? And how do you see this, right? And are there any unintended consequences of these current set of government interventions right now?
Yes. So I would say one big challenge which has come up here, Sarthak, is the point about job losses, right? And this electrification shift has, in fact, is now being talked about that it will lead to these cars, electric cars, requiring less maintenance and fewer repairs than the petrol or diesel cars. So there'll be job loss there. Then, if you look at reports also by a few automakers like Volkswagen, they're very clearly talking about the EVs requiring almost like 30 or 33% fewer workers than traditional IC vehicles on their assembly and manufacturing lines also. So there are those challenges which very clearly exist. But then there is the other side also, right? Because when you're looking at electrification, there are new jobs which will be generated in the renewable electricity sector because now you would need more people to install and maintain charging point for electric cars. And I think more importantly, we also need to look at the supply side interventions, which Manish was also referring to. So there are certain states like Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu which are giving manufacturers a lot of incentives. So their jobs will also be created. But the problem there would be right now that the workforce is not skilled enough to very seamlessly shift from creating internal combustion vehicles to EV vehicles. So therein training of that workforce also becomes very critical and very important in that.
And is there any mitigation strategy, because there will be IC manufacturers, workers over there, different automobile component manufacturers who might get impacted in the process. So, do we have any government interventions which are talking about these mitigation strategies?
I would say employment has not featured very centrally into the intervention areas right now.
Okay.
So it's I think more like a, in terms of the jobs, it is more like a wait and watch how it pans out kind of a scenario.
Mhm.
Because
Hmm.
I don't think even the government in their estimates knows how EVs are going to penetrate into the commercial and private sector. So this will probably is work in progress largely.
Okay. Now, again, this is kind of a hypothetical scenario, but let's assume that you are now hired as a consultant by the PMO, let's say, and you are asked to maybe create a draft policy for adoption of EVs or for production of EVs. You already know that there are these issues, there are some government interventions, they have their limitations. So, if you have to recommend certain changes to the current set of policies, right? So, what will you be using? Will you be going for a different approach, or how will it be? I mean, Ashwin and Manish, both of you can take it up to you.
Sure, would love to do that. So, as a automobile enthusiast, as a driver, let me start the consumer part of it, which I think is probably simpler.
You're
So, we have
automobile enthusiast, but do you prefer an IC or a EV, or have you not?
right now I don't see much future in EV currently in terms of driving pleasure.
Okay. So again, I don't know. There is a conflict of interest here, seems right. If you are given the responsibility of designing a policy for EVs, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we are trying to think like economists and think of the future and population at large and not self-interests. So on the demand side, as a consumer, I think we have two short points. One is, of course, the pricing and availability of electricity for public EV charging. Now, there needs to be a uniform structure across the country for transforming the 2 watt and 3 watt, supply charging points, and probably some kind of decentralization and incentivization is required for home infra and making charging points more widely available. You would have read the reports in the um, press about certain housing colonies objecting to charging points being created in their buildings. There is certain apprehension that this will create more risk, and those unallayed fears are there. So those are things which will affect us from the consumer or the driver from the demand point of view. I'll hand over to Ashwin to cover the supply side.
Thank you, Manish. So, Sarthak, a very interesting question and something on which we also debated a lot, because while we were preparing our set of solutions, we ended up creating 2 dozen of them. But then at the end of it, we also had to take a step back and we realized, running the economy is about how to make the most of scarce resources that you have. So, from a public policy perspective, and from a supply side or a manufacturing side perspective, I'll probably give you the top 3 areas of interventions that we would suggest or we would provoke the current decision makers to work a bit more on. The first very important one would be that we need to start by assessing EV externality through well to wheel emission or life cycle GHG emission and not just tailpipe emission. Because the moment we start doing that, you'll have the right information flowing in through the entire supply chain, right from the input material suppliers to manufacturers to consumers. How that also helps is that the moment you have the government investing on EV electrification, you do it the right way. But then, as an extension of that, we are also saying that don't just focus on that, focus maybe a bit more on electrifying the grid itself and looking at public transport and electrifying, and not just electrifying, but looking at different kind of renewable sources. One very heartening shift has been that the government is parallelly also investing a lot into the hydrogen sector. The recent budget actually just talked a lot more about that, exploring hydrogen energy also as a possibility. So that would be one very core area of intervention we would suggest. We would say that the larger
Ashwin, one thing I wanted to add here, like since you're talking about the life cycle GHG emission, right? You should focus on that, and that is going to help you get a better picture, right? Now, I was also wondering if, let's say, I'm a potential consumer, I want to, I mean, I don't want to use an IC engine, IC vehicle, and I want to have something which is more environmental friendly, but since I don't have an idea or clear picture which kind of EV is better, right, in terms of GHG emissions, right, which emits less throughout its life cycle, it might so happen that I'll be like, okay, I can't trust this manufacturer, I can't trust this manufacturer. I might as well go for ICE vehicles. That is a possibility or not? I mean, I would assume that since there is this information asymmetry, I don't really know. I can't distinguish between these kind of products which are there in the market. I might not even purchase these products, and as a result of which, the market will also remain small. I mean, it will. Right now, the government is pushing a lot of subsidies. That's why possibly people are purchasing it. If you don't have that, maybe the market will remain small. So, will the idea about these GHG emissions and throughout the entire cycle help address this issue? Maybe the market will be more optimal.
Correct. So that's a very interesting question, and it could have many different approaches to it. But I'll probably take a step back, and I'll look at the current intellectual exercise of the CO2 calculator that exists for EV vehicles. So even if you log into the e-Amrit portal right now of the government, it has a very good calculator which talks about the difference between tailpipe vehicle emissions or ICE tailpipe emissions and EV emissions, which very clearly shows that EVs are much better. Now, the fact that we are saying once you add life cycle emissions, it's not like, and there are now studies which exist for this, it's not like EVs will become much, much worse off. The only thing that will happen is it will give you transparent information. It might just tell you the impact of having 80% of your grid being run through coal and fossil fuel. So maybe then the breaking point or the break even point, as they say, of your vehicle sort of being carbon neutral, probably in the Western world right now for an EV is 1.5 to 2 years, because their grid is more green and they drive more.
Yeah.
But if we put those exact numbers for India, maybe the EV will be around 4 years or 5 years for India. Even that is very good. All we are saying is that visibility will actually help drive in maybe even more consumers. Because right now that lack of information also is one major problem.
Okay, just to add from the driver's perspective or the buyer's perspective, the quality of the vehicle being provided would also affect the market. So if you have big players like say Tata, Toyota, Hyundai, Suzuki producing quality products, you would find consumers going for those kind of vehicles. Currently, in the 2 and 3 wheeler sector, the products available are of very poor quality. They don't inspire any kind of confidence and are not likely to really sustain development of the EV market. So the quality of the product being brought in is also being ensured in an indirect way to bolster the EV market.
Okay, nice. So Ashwin, we were talking about some three-pronged strategy, right?
Yes.
So I think first leg you talked about. What are the other three?
Yes. Then the
Other two,
second
sorry.
one, very correct. The second one very clearly has to be this larger strategy to shift away from just demand side intervention in EVs to more supply side interventions. And Manish has covered a lot of that. But if you ask us the main areas, it's basically looking at plug and play solutions for MSME in the field right now, because there are so many startups. They are trying to create their own ecosystem. They really need a central solution or a central infrastructure which they can access, and that's where R&D or investment from biggest of the technocrats will really help. So that is one area that we say has to be one of the larger strategies if you're focusing on EVs as one of the main type of technology. And then, of course, the third one for us is invest lopsided into companies, startups, and R&D, which can transform your battery and mineral usage technology. It's very important because right now, in the gung-ho nature of going EV, we are actually forgetting that the ethical aspect of sourcing the material and the methods of production will start becoming even more important years down the line when the EV sector itself will start going. So rather than being caught napping then, we are suggesting that work on that should start now, because that will start addressing the complicated web of issues with respect to the global back-end supply chain of electrification, right? So those are our top three areas.
Yeah. So basically, how to use the reuse batteries and all those things. We should focus on
Absolutely. Battery swapping incentives have also started coming in. The government is focusing. That is one area, and very rightfully so.
Yeah. Also, I think standardization of batteries and all those things can also play a role here, I guess, because that will ensure that the markets become larger. There is interoperability. I think there are some draft guidelines related to EV batteries, battery standards, but I'm not sure how well it is functioning right now.
Yes, not yet fully implemented. But again, the good point is that it's been thought through and debated enough in the policy circles now. So it should be coming out very soon. And it's a very important point which is required, because that will ensure circularity of EVs itself rather than us having new waste material which starts collecting because of EVs.
Yeah. So I think this is a good way to end this discussion. We should have more discussions, deliberations, and this is something which is for this particular problem is a forward-looking thing, right? So that more debates, more discussions can ensure that we have a better, refined solution for the future. Ashwin and Manish, do you have any concluding remarks?
I just want to quote from one of the books written by Isaac Asimov, it's the Foundation series, where very interestingly, there are atomic motors which are driving mobility. It could be spaceship, it could be a home car. So maybe EVs may lead to EV atomic motors in the future. Why not?
Interesting. Ashwin?
I would just leave with probably one message. Let EV be one of the solutions that will drive the mobility sector itself going more renewable. And the moment we let more types of technology also play out, we'll probably see a very different picture maybe 10 years down the line.
Yeah, thanks Ashwin. Thanks Manish for joining us for this podcast and enlightening our listeners about the EV sector. Thanks to the listeners for tuning in. We'll meet again in one more episode of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takstashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.